South Africa. I know I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but South Africa is a unique country. Not because of colonialism, which as you know most African countries experienced, but because of apartheid. It is colonialism and apartheid that forms the most influential part of South Africa's historical context, and what we will be looking at in this presentation. People have been living in Africa for 100,000 years. The Sand people were foragers, much like the Effie foragers you saw in the video last week, and the pastoral Khoi herded animals, which they used for food. These two groups lived in southern Africa long before the Bantu-speaking tribes arrived about 2,500 years ago. The first European to sail around the southernmost tip of Africa was a Portuguese explorer, Bartholomew Dias, in 1488. At this time, European countries were looking for a route to India for spices. While Dias was rounding Africa, Columbus was looking for money for his trip west in hopes of finding India by going the other way. Bumping into a continent the Europeans didn't even know about led Columbus to believe he had actually found India, hence he called the indigenous people Indians. Dias called the Cape of Africa Cape of Storms because of the horrible storms around the Cape. The name was later changed to the Cape of Good Hope, perhaps to encourage explorers or because of the hope of riches from the spice trade. In 1652, less than 200 years later, the Dutch East India Company brought 82 men and 8 women to settle on the Cape. They spoke a Dutch dialect that was called Afrikaans. There are 11 official languages in South Africa today, and Afrikaans is the third most spoken. The actress Charlize Theron speaks Afrikaans. Settlers continued to come to the Cape, mostly from Holland, Germany, and France, so that by the 18th century there are about 15,000 Boers or Afrikaners, as they were known. Descendants of the Dutch settlers were farmers, and there was an ever-growing need for more land. These trek Boers, as they were called, continually expanded the white territory. This of course resulted in a number of wars with the Khoi, the Xhosa, and the Zulus. In the beginning, whites and black settlements were separated by the Fish River, but as the whites annexed more and more land, the black population was subjugated, that is, conquered and controlled. By the mid-19th century, all the land formerly inhabited by indigenous people was in the hands of white settlers, and the Boers, in fact, had by that time established 2 republics. The British had their own colonies in southern Africa by then, and wanted to unite all of them into one union. This led to the Boer Wars, the second of which was particularly bloody, and ended in the defeat of the Boers in 1902. The Union of South Africa, a British colony, was then formed in 1910. This was a modern state in which only the white population could vote. The black people were subjugated to a policy of concealed expatriation, meaning they weren't considered citizens in their own country. In fact, shortly thereafter, 13% of South Africa was declared reservations for the blacks. So the foundation of the disastrous policy of apartheid was laid. What is apartheid? Apartheid was racism made law. Numerous laws allowed the ruling white minority to subjugate, exploit, and terrorize the vast majority, mostly Africans, but also Asians and coloreds, that is, people of mixed races. And as you read the reading on South Africa, you will notice that people are separated into these categories: white, African, Asian, and colored. It's the first time that we have had a country in which the ethnicity of people is absolutely ignored, and people are categorized by race. The black people were basically denied human rights and political rights. Their work was exploited, their lives segregated, and the minutest details of how and where the large black majority would live, work, and die was dictated. This system of institutionalized racial discrimination defied the principles of the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The next two slides give you just some examples of the laws that were passed as a part of apartheid. And you notice on this page, these were just a few of the laws that were passed in 2 years. Prohibition of mixed marriages, making it criminal to have sexual relations, people of different races, requiring all people to register as black, white, or colored. Later they added Asian Indians, barring people of particular races from certain urban areas, removing colors from the common voters' roll, just a variety of ways to separate the races as they saw them. Here we see some more apartheid laws prohibiting people of different races from using the same public amenities, drinking fountains, restrooms, park benches, trains, buses, cinemas, restaurants, beaches. People were separated by race in every way possible. Now, of course, if you didn't like the law, you could protest against it, but no, they didn't want that to happen, and so they made a law that increased the penalties for those people who protested against laws, including fines, imprisonments, whippings. They made a law that was designed to reduce the level of education by black people and formalized racial discrimination in employment. Finally, they set up independent homelands, quote unquote, for black people. What this means is they designated certain places for black people to live, which eliminated all of the rest of the country from their occupation. They banned any organization which did not support the government as it stood. And then one of my favorite. They changed the status of the inhabitants of the homelands so that they were no longer even considered citizens of South Africa and had none of the rights that came with citizenship. It is amazing, is it not? I mean, this is my lifetime we're talking about, that a government would do this to not only a portion of their population, but the vast majority, in order to keep control. If you didn't know the law, or in case you forgot, then there were signs posted so that it was very clear what you had a right to do or not. This one isn't very clear, but you can see these public premises and the amenities thereof have been reserved for the exclusive use of white persons. Here is an example from 1978 of the effectiveness of the preferential treatment of whites in a variety of ways. And you can see the difference in population. 19 million blacks, 4.5 million whites. Who owned the land? Whites, 87%. Who had a share of the national income? 75% went to whites. The ratio of average earnings, 14:1. Now this is also interesting. Look at the taxable income. We already know blacks are making 14 times less than whites, but they are taxing the blacks on a smaller income than the whites. In other words, the whites can make more money before they even start taxing them. Doctors to population, 1 to 400 versus 1 to 44,000. How often do you think you'd get to see a doctor if you had 1 for 44,000 people? The infant mortality rate was astronomical for blacks, 20% in urban areas, 40% in rural areas, compared to less than 3% for whites. The annual expenditure on education, almost $700 versus $45. And then at the end you see the teacher-pupil ratio. So the people who were making the laws were setting out to discriminate legally against blacks for this specific purpose. On this page we see a girl looking out a window of her shack. We see a classroom, young children, many young children and one teacher. We see young children in a black township. The bottom page you cannot see the headlines, but it is a headline on a Johannesburg street which refers to a government plan in 1982 to cede territory and people to Swaziland. Swaziland is a country, a tiny little country inside the borders of South Africa if you look on the map. And so the idea is to just give territory and people to this other country without even asking the people who were affected by it. Shock and anger at this point makes me stop and ask, how did this happen? Well, it isn't so different from what the Europeans did in other colonies, is it? Few African indigenous people were given any rights by their colonists. The American settlers certainly tried to kill off the Native Americans and finally relocated the ones who survived to reservations. The blacks in America came as slaves and had few rights until 1864. And of course, there's Nazi Germany. The Nazis murdered from 15 to 31 million people, mostly men, women, handicapped, aged, sick, prisoners of war, forced laborers, camp inmates, critics, homosexuals, Jews, Slavs, Serbs, Czechs, Italians, Poles, French, Ukrainians, and others. And among these were 1 million children who were under 18 years old. And this is in addition to those, both civilian and military, who were killed from combat. Perhaps that's what makes South Africa's apartheid so horrible. After World War II, we believed that the victory had brought the end to that kind of world. And here we have it just beginning in South Africa. The next couple of slides provide a timeline of South African apartheid so that you might see what was happening from its beginning to its end. The South African government launched a system of apartheid in 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II. The next year, the ANC adopted a program of action which was authored by Nelson Mandela and others, calling for strikes, boycotts, and defiance. In 1952, the ANC Defiance Campaign was launched. This was a mass movement of resistance to apartheid, encouraging campaigns against apartheid laws, and in 1955 demanding a new South Africa. The ANC was originally founded in 1912, just a year after the government of the newly formed Union of South Africa began a systematic oppression of black people. Its members founded the organization to increase the rights of black South African population. And you will see the ANC mentioned several times throughout this timeline. About that time, the United Nations recognized that South African issue was an international issue and something that was beyond just the country itself. Nelson Mandela was charged with treason at this time. Although he was found not guilty, he left the country because of that situation. In 1959, the Parliament passed the Separate Homelands Laws, which segregated the majority black groups from the rest of the population. In 1960, black protests against apartheid ended with the police killing 69 people in the Sharpeville massacre. While he was underground, Nelson Mandela wrote a letter in which he stated the famous words, quote, "The struggle is my life. I will continue fighting for freedom until the end of my days." Not long after he returned to South Africa, about 17 months, Nelson Mandela was arrested and charged with illegal exit from the country and incitement to strike. He argued that he had no duty to obey the laws of a white parliament in which he was not represented. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. While serving this sentence, he was charged with sabotage. Mandela's statements in court during these trials are classic in the history of resistance to apartheid. He wrote, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1974, because of apartheid, South Africa was expelled from the UN. In 1976, more than 600 students were killed who were protesting. In 1977, the leader of the protest, Stephen Biko, was killed in police custody. I have included this slide about Stephen Biko partly because his biography was made into a movie entitled Cry Freedom. And so this is something that you could watch and actually see an enactment, at least, of what was happening in South Africa at that time and the consequences for people who were involved. Denzel Washington plays Stephen Biko in this movie. It was a worldwide incident in the sense that there was an outcry about the brutal circumstances of his death, and he did become a martyr and a symbol of black resistance against the oppressive apartheid regime. As a result, the UN Security Council responded by imposing an arms embargo against South Africa. Biko's family sued the state for damages, but settled out of court for about $25,000. The police responsible for his death applied for amnesty in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings that were held after the end of apartheid, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. The Biko family didn't ask the commission, though, for a finding on his death. Biko was killed in 1977. In 1983, the government allowed the white farmers to rearm in order to protect themselves from the black dissidents, and charged the dissidents with a number of murders, mutilations, rapes, and robberies. In 1985, Nelson Mandela turned down an offer to be released from prison. He rejected the offers on the grounds that prisoners cannot enter into contracts. Only free men can negotiate, he said. A state of emergency was declared that year over much of the country and was renewed until 1989. There was a lot of violence going on throughout this entire time. In 1988, amnesty was announced for dissidents and 122 surrendered. In 1989, the National Party won the general election and F.W. de Klerk was elected as president of South Africa. This was the party who had been in power throughout this time. That same year, President de Klerk met with Nelson Mandela to discuss the country's political future. In 1990, de Klerk lifted the ban outlawing the ANC, and Nelson Mandela was freed from prison after 27 years. In 1991, Mandela became the president of the ANC, and that year the International Olympics Committee lifted a 21-year ban which had barred South African athletes from the Olympic Games. In 1993, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk won the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway. And in 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the President of South Africa. This is the Mandela quote that I read to you earlier, and a picture of Mandela casting the ballot in the country's first all-race elections in 1994, and then addressing the crowd in Pretoria after he had been elected. So, what happened afterwards? Often, when oppressed people become empowered, they retaliate against their oppressors so that the situation remains the same, except that there are just different people in those roles. This happened in Rwanda, it happened in Bosnia. Nelson Mandela didn't want this to happen. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created. It was a court-like body that was assembled so that anyone who was a victim of violence could come forward and be heard. And the perpetrators of the violence could also give testimony and request amnesty. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was seen by many as a crucial component of the transition to full and free democracy in South Africa. And in spite of its flaws, has been thought to be successful. The mandate of the Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, was to bear witness to, record, and in some cases grant amnesty to the perpetrators of crimes relating to human violations, reparation, and rehabilitation. No side was exempt from appearing before the Commission. It heard reports of human rights violations and considered amnesty applications from the apartheid state or the white government, as well as the liberation forces, including the ANC. Out of 7,112 petitioners, 5,392 people were refused amnesty and 849 were granted amnesty. When you think about what the people had been through in apartheid, this is an amazing thing to me. It's not been very long since democracy was established in South Africa, and they are still struggling to overcome the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. In 2004, BBC News asked South Africans how life had changed after a decade of democracy. I'd like you to go to this website and look at the photos of the 8 people and read what they had to say. It will give you a sense of what has changed and the challenges that remain. Currently, South Africa is celebrating the hosting of a successful tournament of the International Federation of Football Associations, or the World Cup. This is the championship of soccer that is held every 4 years. It lasted from the 1st of June to the 11th of July, and over 700 million people watched the final game. It was a cultural feast of people-to-people relations and anti-racist sentiment. A major contribution of the World Cup in Africa seems to be a strengthening of Pan-African culture and the deepening of the bonds of solidarity and internationalism. Such momentum must be continued in the struggle for a more peaceful and just world. It's not been very long since democracy was established in South Africa, and they are still struggling to overcome the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. In 2004, BBC News asked South Africans how life had changed after a decade of democracy. I'd like you to go to this website and look at the photos of the 8 people and read what they had to say. It will give you a sense of what has changed and the challenges that remain. Currently, South Africa is celebrating the hosting of a successful tournament of the International Federation of Football Associations, or the World Cup. This is the championship of soccer that is held every 4 years. It lasted from the 1st of June to the 11th of July, and over 700 million people watched the final game. It was a cultural feast of people-to-people relations and anti-racist sentiment. A major contribution of the World Cup in Africa seems to be a strengthening of Pan-African culture and the deepening of the bonds of solidarity and internationalism. Such momentum must be continued in the struggle for a more peaceful and just world.